The Galactic Council's Grand Chamber smelled like wax and arrogance, its alien delegates preening in ceremonial robes, whispering in their dialects as the human observer arrived, except this was no ordinary human. As he stepped through the towering archway, a hush fell over the delegates, for Kane was smiling, but not kindly. His suitcase clicked with each step as he approached the center podium, pausing just long enough to murmur something that silenced even the noisiest of them. "I am what your nightmares have nightmares about." The translator drones hesitated, almost refusing to carry his words into the vast chamber, but once they did, it was as though a shadow passed through every heart and gland present. Then he chuckled softly, as if embarrassed by his own theatricality, and nodded courteously. "Observer Kane from Earth, at your service." Moments earlier, they had been laughing. Council members believed Earth was weak, irrelevant, its people quaint primitives who still consumed fermented liquids to dull their emotional distress and fired metal projectiles to resolve disputes. The Galactic Council's invitation had been written with mockery disguised as diplomacy, a chance to put a token human on display like a trained animal. But now their posture was changing, their glances shifting from amused to uneasy. Kane's tailored gray suit, so drab and ordinary, seemed somehow sharper than any of their elaborate finery. His briefcase was clearly battered by age yet carried with precision, as though its scratches were intentional marks of some forgotten campaign. The chief speaker, a glistening creature with translucent skin that revealed slow-pulsing blood vessels beneath, welcomed Kane with a practiced smile. "Human Observer Kane, we extend to you the warmest honor of the Galactic Council. It is our pleasure to have you among us." He gestured to the ceremonial seat prepared for Kane, a small, impractical chair clearly designed to reinforce Earth's supposed inferiority. Kane did not sit. Instead, he paced slowly, his footsteps echoing far louder than physics would normally allow in the dampened chamber. "I appreciate the warmth," Kane said, though his tone carried neither gratitude nor warmth. "I've heard much about the Council's commitment to peace and order." His gaze swept the delegates, pausing just enough on each for them to feel personally inspected. "I have also heard much about your security. Truly impressive." His last two words dripped with amusement, almost childlike curiosity, but there was something else beneath them, a challenge. His request to audit the Council's security protocols was met first with polite laughter, then awkward glances as he repeated the request without smiling. "Perhaps this is a primitive human custom," said one delegate from the Amphibian Collective, their voice sticky with condescension. Kane turned his head toward them, his expression mild, eyes calculating. "No, not primitive at all. Just thorough." His fingers tapped lightly on the handle of his suitcase, producing an odd rhythm that made the Amphibian flinch despite themselves. That night, security personnel noticed Kane standing alone by one of the observation decks. He seemed captivated by the stars beyond, a quiet figure dwarfed by the swirling galaxies outside. A junior guard, curious and unimpressed by rumors of Earth's so-called special agent, approached him. "Everything all right, sir?" Kane did not turn immediately. Instead, he whispered something to the glass. The guard stepped closer, just in time to hear Kane's words carried back faintly from the smooth surface. "I have killed in stranger places than this." The chill that ran through the guard was not from the temperature-controlled air. Back in the council chamber, the delegates resumed their discussions, but the easy laughter was gone. The chief speaker called for another welcoming ceremony, a formal dinner where Kane could be introduced properly and paraded around, re-establishing control of the narrative. The meal itself was absurdly lavish, featuring dishes harvested from 17 worlds. Kane sat politely, nodding appreciatively as an enormous insectoid ambassador explained the significance of each course. During the second course, a gelatinous delicacy that jiggled unpleasantly with every breath, Kane leaned forward and asked the insectoid about a rumored corruption scandal involving their homeworld. His tone was casual, almost friendly. The ambassador froze, mandibles quivering. I have no idea what you're talking about," they stammered. Kane smiled and spooned a portion of the quivering food onto his plate, still watching the ambassador carefully. "Oh, my mistake, of course. You must forgive me. Earth has a reputation for misunderstanding things. It's a flaw we're working on." Throughout the meal, similar moments occurred. Kane asked seemingly innocent questions that struck at the heart of private council scandals, always with that same bland courtesy. By the end of the dinner, even the most confident delegates were no longer enjoying their food. Later, when Kane formally requested access to review the council's security protocols, no one dared openly refuse him. The chief of security, a hulking reptilian with ceremonial scars across its snout, escorted Kane personally, maintaining a rigid silence. Kane nodded thoughtfully as they passed each security checkpoint, pausing occasionally to inspect consoles and cameras. At one point, he gently corrected a guard's stance, murmuring something about blind spots and reaction times. The guard obeyed without question, looking pale beneath their scales. Back in his temporary quarters, Kane unpacked his battered suitcase carefully. Inside were not the tools of a diplomat but an array of devices whose purpose was unclear, all matte black, compact, and lovingly maintained. He arranged them with precision on the simple desk provided by the council, his fingers trailing across each one as if reacquainting himself with old friends. Then he sat, staring at the door, listening. Every sound from the corridor reached him: the whispered conversations, the hurried footsteps, the hiss of nervous exhalations. He smiled again, but this time there was no warmth at all. The Galactic Council believed they had invited a bureaucrat, an observer from a harmless backwater planet. What they had actually invited was the Boogeyman himself, and by the time they realized their mistake, it would already be far too late. The morning after Kane's unsettling arrival, the Galactic Council convened in private session, the atmosphere far from the triumphant mood of the welcoming ceremony. Delegates whispered among themselves, their voices a mixture of curiosity and anxiety. No one openly admitted to being unnerved, but their nervous glances and twitching appendages betrayed them. Kane, meanwhile, sat in the visitors' gallery, silent and still, as if carved from stone, his pale hands folded neatly on the battered suitcase that never left his side. When the chief speaker formally called for proceedings to begin, Kane smiled and nodded courteously, the picture of decorum, but his gaze never softened, never lost its unnerving intensity. The delegates resumed their usual arrogance in speech, their tone dripping with condescension as they debated trade routes, tariffs, and security funding, all the while sneaking glances at the humans seated above them. They tried to convince themselves that the unease they felt was simply a reaction to cultural differences. Surely Earth's representative was simply eccentric, they reasoned. Just another curious quirk of a backwater species. Still, cracks in their confidence began to show. When the representative from the Ralthus Dominion boasted about his species' long tradition of military dominance, Kane tilted his head and made a note in his small leather-bound notebook, prompting a sudden pause from the blustering delegate. From his elevated perch, Kane's mild smile and polite nods carried a strange weight. Delegates who would normally ignore an observer found themselves adjusting their posture, measuring their words, checking their notes twice before speaking. At the formal lunch that followed, intended to repair any tension and restore the council's illusion of superiority, the humor took on an edge. Delegates made loud jokes at Kane's expense, poking fun at Earth's primitive traditions. The Cormaxian ambassador laughed as he described Earth's practice of shaking appendages as a greeting. Another delegate mocked human reliance on written agreements and laughed at the idea that humans still required physical security guards at government buildings. Kane's response to these jabs was a masterclass in subtle retaliation. Instead of challenging the insults directly, he played along with exaggerated politeness, amplifying the discomfort. When the Cormaxian ambassador joked about human incompetence in warfare, Kane leaned in, eyes glinting with amusement, and replied, "You may be surprised, Ambassador. We humans have always been inventive when cornered." His smile widened slightly, but the warmth in it was gone. As the meal continued, Kane quietly dropped disarming questions into casual conversation, asking about the Amphibian Collective's border skirmishes with their neighbors and inquiring about rumored resource shortages on the Eastern Rim. He even asked the chief speaker himself whether the rumors about vote buying in last year's council elections were exaggerated or true. He framed every question as innocent curiosity, but every delegate at the table could feel that his questions were anything but innocent. Laughter died down, Plates remained half-finished. Delegates who moments ago had mocked Kane now avoided his gaze altogether. Later that afternoon, Kane formally requested a tour of the Council's security network. To maintain appearances, the Chief of Security reluctantly agreed, though he was careful to assign a full detail of armed guards to accompany the human. Kane's tour quickly became a performance. At every security checkpoint, he complimented the systems in place while gently pointing out small inefficiencies that the Chief of Security had overlooked. He offered suggestions on reaction time drills, patrol rotations, and even subtly questioned the encryption standards on the Council's internal communications. The security officers began to regard Kane less as a curiosity and more as an unexpected expert, one who seemed to know their job better than they did. What unnerved them most was how Kane delivered his observations. His tone remained mild, almost deferential. He seemed genuinely impressed with their infrastructure, pausing occasionally to admire surveillance consoles or inspect the design of containment cells. But beneath that veneer of curiosity was a precision that none of the officers could explain. Kane never took notes, never asked the same question twice, and remembered every detail. When he pointed out that one surveillance blind spot near the Council's emergency exit could be exploited by a trained infiltrator, the Chief of Security froze, realizing too late that Kane himself had already identified exactly where he would break into the Council chambers if he ever needed to. Rumors began to circulate among the staff. Council aides whispered that Kane had walked through restricted areas without triggering any alarms, even though they could swear he had never been granted access codes. Others claimed that cameras monitoring Kane would periodically go dark for exactly 5 seconds at a time, as if something was interfering with them. Security teams checked logs but found no trace of interference. It was as though the human could walk through the most secure corridors completely at will, invisible and unstoppable. By evening, the unease had spread beyond the guards to the Council members themselves. Private meetings were held in hastily secured chambers. Delegates argued over who had authorized the invitation to Earth's observer, and whether it might be wise to quietly withdraw the invitation and send Kane back to his planet. But no one dared act on this impulse. To withdraw an invitation would cause diplomatic embarrassment. Worse, it would admit that the Galactic Council felt threatened by a species it had long regarded as a joke. Pride demanded they maintain the fiction of control. Kane watched it all unfold with amusement. In the grand dining hall that evening, he sat at the edge of the gathering, sipping a mild alien tea as delegates debated minor trade agreements and ceremonial formalities. He intervened only once, gently correcting a speaker who had misstated a statistic about Earth's population. The correction was subtle, but its impact was not. The speaker stumbled, flustered, then excused himself from the floor altogether. Even small gestures from Kane began to carry disproportionate weight. Near the end of the evening, as the crowd thinned and conversation turned awkward and stilted, Kane approached the Council's chief speaker and asked a simple question. If there were an internal emergency tonight, how quickly could you evacuate this chamber? The chief speaker froze, struggling for a diplomatic answer, but Kane smiled softly and raised a hand as if to apologize. No need to answer now. I'd just like to be prepared, you understand. Earth's health and safety protocols, you see. We are very cautious. Then he bowed politely and departed, leaving the chief speaker staring after him, beads of sweat forming on his translucent skin. Back in his quarters, Kane sat quietly once more, polishing a small metallic device from his battered suitcase. Outside his door, guards stood tense and silent, glancing at each other nervously every few minutes. The delegates thought they had invited a powerless observer from a minor world. They thought they controlled the game. But Kane was already moving the pieces on the board, and he was enjoying every second of it. The Galactic Council was beginning to sense that they had made a terrible mistake, but it was only the beginning. The next day dawned with a heavy tension that clung to every corridor of the Galactic Council complex. Delegates arrived earlier than usual, nervous and distracted, glancing at security patrols with newfound suspicion. In the center of it all, Observer Kane moved calmly, methodically, never hurried, always composed. His presence seemed to warp the very air around him. Where he went, silence followed. Where he paused, guards straightened their backs or quietly stepped away altogether. The polite mask of diplomacy was starting to crack. The council's self-assured confidence was eroding, replaced by a quiet but unmistakable fear. By midday, something unthinkable happened. One of the senior delegates, a proud and loud representative from the Zelthorian cluster, did not arrive for the afternoon session. At first, the chief speaker assumed a minor scheduling error and dismissed the absence. But soon a whisper spread among staff and delegates alike. The Zelthorian ambassador's quarters were empty, his private staff missing, his security detail silent. All communication attempts failed. By the time security teams were dispatched, it was too late. The quarters were abandoned. No signs of struggle. No evidence of forced entry. No trace of where the delegate or his entourage had gone. The council chamber fell into disorder. Delegates raised their voices, demanded explanations, pointed fingers. Had there been a kidnapping? A defection? An assassination? Each theory sounded less plausible than the next, but all eyes began to drift toward Kane, seated calmly in the visitors' gallery, quietly observing, fingers steepled under his chin. When his gaze met theirs, most looked away immediately. Those who held his stare felt as though they were being dissected, their minds turned inside out. Amid the growing paranoia, the chief of security convened a private meeting, desperate to regain control. Guards reviewed footage of the delegates' wing from the previous night, expecting to find something, anything, that would point to an intruder or a technical fault. Instead, they found gaps in the records, brief moments where cameras blinked out in perfect synchronization across multiple sectors, always exactly 10 seconds long, always at the same intervals. It was as though a phantom moved through the corridors, invisible to even the most advanced surveillance equipment. The guards checked logs, diagnostics, system backups, all clean. No tampering, no signs of hacking, no evidence of intrusion. Only absence. The chief of security began to sweat, his scarred snout twitching involuntarily. In frustration, he ordered the guards to question Kane directly. The order was carried out that evening. A security team approached Kane in the lounge, where he sat alone, sipping from a delicate glass of something purple and fragrant. He greeted the guards with a pleasant smile and gestured for them to sit, which they did, despite themselves. The leader of the security team cleared his throat, struggling for authority. "Observer Kane, we have questions about your movements last night." Kane set down his glass carefully and folded his hands, leaning forward slightly. "Of course," he said warmly. "Please. Ask away." His tone was calm, almost amused, but there was something behind his eyes, an edge that made even the most hardened guards hesitate. "Where were you during the disappearance of the Zelthorian ambassador?" the guard asked. Kane raised an eyebrow. "My quarters, of course. Resting after a long day of auditing, as your chief of security can confirm. I even requested additional guards outside my door, did I not?" "Ask them. They can vouch for me." And indeed, the guards posted outside Kane's door the night before would later confirm that he had not left. Or at least, that they had not seen him leave. The guards retreated unsettled. The chief of security felt a cold sensation creeping along his spine. He knew something was wrong, but there was nothing he could act upon, no accusation he could prove, no crime he could formally declare. Kane was untouchable. Worse, Kane seemed to know it. As the council gathered for an emergency session the next morning, Kane made a point of arriving precisely on time, with that same battered suitcase in hand, smiling with quiet confidence. Delegates now fell silent as he entered, their private conversations ceasing mid-sentence. Kane sat in his usual seat and casually produced a notepad, jotting a few notes, as the chief speaker stumbled through opening remarks. Then, during the middle of a routine agenda item, Kane raised a hand. The gesture, simple and polite, froze the entire chamber. The chief speaker stammered but nodded in acknowledgement. "Observer Kane, do you wish to address the council?" Kane stood smoothly. "Yes, thank you. If I may, I would simply like to compliment the council's remarkable efficiency. Your proceedings are fascinating." He let the word linger for a moment, the tone flat but somehow laced with a dark amusement. "I also couldn't help but notice that one of your esteemed members has not attended today. Such absences could be problematic, especially when one considers security. I hope everything is in order." The chamber fell into an oppressive silence. Delegates looked from one to another, no one willing to speak. Kane smiled again and sat down, crossing his legs calmly, resuming his notes as though nothing had happened. The chief speaker struggled to recover, his voice cracking as he moved hastily to the next agenda item. The tension in the room was palpable, the unease now undeniable. After the session, delegates met in hurried private conversations, their voices hushed, their words frantic. Some demanded immediate action, proposing that Kane be expelled or detained. Others argued for caution, terrified of provoking him further. Still others insisted that the entire affair was a coincidence, a mere string of unfortunate events. But no one believed that truly. They were lying to themselves out of fear. Every one of them felt it now, that cold realization that the human observer was not what he seemed, that there was something darker beneath the surface. Back in his quarters, Kane opened his suitcase once more, revealing its contents carefully. He did not need any of the tools yet. Not really. He simply enjoyed the ritual of checking them, cleaning them, preparing them. As he worked, his mind drifted over the day's events. The disappearance of the Zelthorian ambassador had achieved precisely what he intended. It seeded paranoia, fractured trust, and set the delegates at each other's throats. Already, he could sense the fault lines forming, the old rivalries reawakening, the careful alliances unraveling. He smiled to himself, leaning back in the chair, watching the lights of distant stars outside his window. The council thought they could manipulate Earth by offering an invitation to a harmless observer. What they failed to understand was that Kane was not sent to observe. He was sent to judge. And slowly, carefully, invisibly, he was preparing to deliver that judgment. The Galactic Council was starting to fall apart from the inside, and Kane had not even lifted a finger in anger yet. There would be no grand speeches, no declarations of war, no armies descending from the sky. There would only be Kane, quiet and precise, moving through their halls like a shadow, until they destroyed themselves out of fear and suspicion. By the time they realized what was happening, it would be too late. Kane would ensure that. By the following morning, the entire council complex felt different. What had once been a seat of power and self-assured order was now tense and brittle, the air heavy with suspicion. Guards were doubled in every hallway, surveillance teams monitored their own colleagues, and every delegate seemed locked in private huddled conversations, all while stealing nervous glances at observer Kane. The disappearance of the Zelthorian ambassador was no longer discussed openly, but the absence loomed over every interaction. Whispers spread faster than official memos, and paranoia gripped even the most arrogant of delegates. The chamber that had once roared with the sound of self-important debates was subdued, filled with false smiles and brittle pleasantries. Kane sat among them, calm as ever, quietly writing notes in his worn notebook and sipping a steaming cup of alien tea. Every movement he made, no matter how trivial, drew attention. The simple act of crossing his legs caused two delegates to shift nervously in their seats, and another to hastily leave the room. Even when he said nothing, Kane dominated the room with his presence alone. The chief speaker tried to steer proceedings back to normal business, calling for order and demanding progress on a routine trade agreement, but no one was truly listening. Every delegate was too distracted, too preoccupied with questions they dared not speak aloud. Was Kane responsible for what had happened? How had he achieved it? Would there be another disappearance? Worse yet, would the next target be them? The underlying dread twisted their minds, driving them to suspicion and fear. It was then that the fractures Kane had been carefully widening began to crack fully open. During a closed-door budget meeting that afternoon, a minor accusation between two delegates exploded into a shouting match. The delegate from the Amphibian Collective accused the Rauthus Dominion of exploiting Council security resources for personal profit. The Rauthus delegate, already on edge, fired back with accusations of espionage and sabotage. Within moments, what should have been a procedural conversation devolved into open insults, threats, and challenges. Kane watched from his corner of the room, silent, his eyes dancing with quiet amusement. He made no attempt to intervene, no effort to calm tempers. Instead, he sat back, sipping his tea and letting their paranoia do his work for him. By the evening, the atmosphere within the council complex had shifted again, this time to outright fear. Several delegates began traveling with their own personal security escorts, refusing to trust the council's guards. Others demanded additional surveillance equipment in their private chambers, only to find that the council's security systems were already stretched to the breaking point and plagued by inexplicable technical failures. Reports flooded into the chief of security, cameras malfunctioning without cause, encrypted doors unlocking themselves in the dead of night, private communications mysteriously intercepted. No matter how many protocols they reviewed or how many system audits they conducted, they found no explanation. And yet, as the evidence of chaos mounted, Kane moved unhurried through the corridors, always alone, always calm, never raising his voice, never once directly threatening anyone. In desperation, a small faction of delegates met secretly and devised a plan. They would eliminate Kane quietly, stage it as an accident, and declare the matter resolved. They justified it as a necessary action to protect the integrity of the council. That evening, they sent an assassin, a mercenary known for subtlety and success, to Kane's private quarters. The assassin never returned. Hours later, guards found his body not outside Kane's door but in a supply closet 3 floors below, his expression frozen in horror, untouched by violence yet unmistakably dead. No marks, no wounds, no indication of struggle. Just fear. The delegates who had ordered the assassination attempt quietly withdrew their proposal the next morning, their faces pale, their voices trembling. As news of the failed attempt spread, the delegates fell deeper into paranoia. Every conversation became an accusation, every glance a potential threat. Kane's reputation grew with each whisper, no longer merely an odd human observer but something far more sinister, an unstoppable force cloaked in human skin. Delegates spoke of him as if he were some ancient myth made real, a creature of shadow that could not be touched, only endured. And Kane encouraged it, offering subtle comments and quiet smiles at precisely the right moments to fan the flames of their terror. When 2 delegates openly argued in the council chamber, Kane tilted his head slightly and asked a single question, delivered with his usual soft politeness. "Is everything all right?" The effect was immediate and devastating. Both delegates fell silent, their faces draining of color. They sat down without another word, the entire chamber falling into stunned silence. Kane had not raised his voice, had not made a demand, and yet his simple question had carried more authority than any decree the council had issued in decades. The chief speaker, desperate to regain control, approached Kane privately after that day's session. He invited Kane to his office for tea, attempting to reclaim some sense of decorum and authority. Kane accepted graciously, sitting calmly across from the chief speaker in the dimly lit room. The chief speaker began by praising Kane's intelligence and professionalism, carefully framing his words with diplomatic precision. Then, cautiously, he broached the subject of the council's recent difficulties, hinting that perhaps it would be best if Kane curtailed his involvement for a while, suggesting that Earth's observer could perhaps work remotely or from a different location. Kane listened patiently, nodding at the appropriate moments, his expression unreadable. When the chief speaker finally finished his careful speech, Kane set down his teacup and leaned forward slightly. "I understand completely," he said, his voice soft and polite. "You are concerned for my well-being, of course." The chief speaker nodded quickly, relief flooding his features. "Yes, exactly." Kane smiled, and the smile did not reach his eyes. "But you see, I prefer to remain. There are things I must observe personally." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. "Besides, you would not wish to offend Earth by suggesting otherwise, would you?" The chief speaker froze, realizing that Kane had turned his own diplomatic language against him. He could not refuse without causing an interstellar incident, could not force Kane to leave without admitting that the council feared him. Kane rose smoothly from his chair and bowed politely. "Thank you for the tea, Chief Speaker. It was delightful." Then he turned and left, moving through the halls with that same deliberate grace, leaving behind a leader broken by fear and trapped by his own diplomacy. The council was now fully under Kane's influence, though he had never made a single overt threat, never brandished a weapon, never issued a command. His power lay in their fear, their paranoia, their inability to understand what he was or how he moved so freely through their most secure halls. And as he returned to his quarters that night, Kane smiled to himself once more. The game was far from over. The real dismantling of the Galactic Council was only just beginning. The dawn that followed brought no relief to the Galactic Council. If anything, the dread that gripped its chambers seemed thicker, almost palpable, an invisible fog that clung to every conversation and gesture. Delegates no longer even attempted to laugh or dismiss Kane's presence as harmless. Their smiles were brittle, their discussions halting and tense. Even the most bombastic representatives now spoke in hushed tones, glancing constantly at the quiet human who sat calmly, observing every detail as though nothing unusual had happened. His battered suitcase remained at his side, closed and untouched, its purpose a mystery that gnawed at the back of every mind in the chamber. Kane's transformation from curiosity to quiet tyrant had occurred without a single declaration or overt action, yet every delegate could feel the shift. The assassination attempt that had failed so mysteriously was no longer discussed, but its effect hung in the air like a silent warning. The Council's security teams patrolled ceaselessly, but their presence offered no comfort. If anything, their constant movement simply reinforced the reality that they no longer controlled their own chamber. As midday approached, a private communication from Earth arrived, addressed directly to Kane and marked as urgent. The Council's communication officers, now so thoroughly unnerved by anything involving the human observer, delivered the encrypted message with trembling hands. Kane accepted it calmly, nodding with polite thanks before retreating to a private antechamber to read it. Minutes passed. Then nearly an hour. Delegates whispered furiously among themselves, debating what instructions Earth might have sent and whether this marked an escalation. When Kane finally returned, he carried himself with the same deliberate calm, but his expression was colder, sharper. He stood in the center of the chamber and waited until the chief speaker, who now looked exhausted and defeated, granted him the floor without hesitation. "Thank you," Kane began, his voice soft and courteous. "I would like to inform the Council that my report to Earth is now complete." He allowed the words to settle over the room. The silence was absolute. Delegates leaned forward in their seats despite themselves, unable to resist the need to hear what came next. "I have examined your protocols, your governance, your conduct," Kane continued. His tone remained polite, his gaze measured and cool, but the weight behind each word was undeniable. "I have found significant deficiencies." His pause was deliberate, letting the impact settle like a blade gently laid across a throat. "The Galactic Council has failed the audit." There was a collective intake of breath, a ripple of fear that no one could mask. Some delegates opened their mouths as if to protest, but no words came out. Others sat frozen, their faces pale or their skin tones dimmed in shock. Kane's next words were delivered with clinical precision. "As of this moment, Earth no longer recognizes the authority of this council. Our relationship has changed. I have been authorized to initiate corrective action." For a heartbeat, the chamber remained frozen. Then chaos erupted. Delegates shouted over one another, some calling for emergency measures, others demanding explanations or retreating into desperate pleas for compromise. The chief speaker rose to his feet, waving for calm, but his voice cracked and wavered. Lost in the din, security teams rushed forward to restore order, but none approached Kane directly. He stood unmoving, perfectly still in the eye of the storm, his expression calm and unreadable. Suddenly, the lights in the chamber flickered. Screens around the walls dimmed, then went dark. Doors locked themselves with soft mechanical clicks that echoed through the vast space. A deep hum filled the air, low and steady, vibrating through the floor beneath their feet. Kane turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the room, meeting the eyes of every delegate in turn. His voice, soft and almost gentle, cut through the chaos with ease. "Stand down. The doors are sealed. No one will leave until this matter is resolved." And then came the final twist. Hidden panels in the walls opened silently, and from them emerged figures the council had never noticed before. Human operatives in plain uniforms, indistinguishable from the cleaning staff and maintenance crews who had worked the corridors unnoticed for weeks. These operatives moved with precision, efficiently securing key systems, shutting down communications, locking out security teams. The revelation hit the delegates like a thunderbolt. Earth's infiltration had begun long before Kane arrived. The human presence was not new. They had been here, embedded and waiting, hidden in plain sight. Kane's arrival had merely been the final phase. The chief speaker collapsed into his seat, his face slack with shock. His voice, when it finally returned, was hoarse and trembling. What is it you want?" Kane's answer was simple, delivered without malice but with finality. "Order. Transparency. Compliance. You will submit to Earth's oversight effective immediately. Your institutions will be audited, your practices corrected, your corruption exposed. If you resist, you will be removed. Not through invasion, not through war, but through dissolution. You will destroy yourselves in the chaos that follows. The choice is yours." Delegates sat frozen, their minds racing, realizing the trap they had walked into. For generations they had dismissed Earth as backward, primitive, beneath their attention. Now they understood how deeply they had underestimated the human capacity for patience, cunning, and subtlety. Kane had played the part of observer perfectly, never raising his voice, never threatening overtly, never taking a step that could be challenged diplomatically. And yet, he had completely unraveled them from within. A few desperate delegates attempted to rally support, to call for unity and resistance. But their voices faltered as their colleagues remained seated, broken by fear and doubt. The operatives lining the walls made no move to threaten or attack, yet their presence was enough to ensure that no one dared rise in defiance. Kane moved slowly to the chief speaker's podium and placed his battered suitcase gently on its surface. He opened it for the first time in view of the entire chamber. Inside were no weapons, no explosives, no tools of terror. Instead, the suitcase contained stacks of reports, data files, detailed analyses of every failing, every instance of corruption, every act of negligence committed by the Council. The weapon Kane had wielded all along was information, gathered patiently and meticulously during his time among them, extracted with quiet precision from their own records and conversations. He did not need to destroy them himself. He had ensured that the truth of their corruption would destroy them. As he closed the suitcase once more, Kane offered a final polite smile to the chamber. "Earth does not seek war," he said quietly. "Only accountability. You may govern yourselves if you wish. Or you may allow Earth to help you rebuild. But you will no longer hide behind empty rituals and false superiority. Your time of unquestioned rule is over." The corridors of the council complex, once filled with haughty delegates and preening officials, now echoed with an eerie stillness. Word of Kane's quiet but absolute coup had spread faster than official channels could contain. The council chambers remained locked in stunned paralysis while outside, staff and aides moved as if afraid their footsteps alone might draw the attention of the human observer who had dismantled their masters without firing a single shot. But Kane himself was already elsewhere, walking calmly through the now subdued halls, his suitcase at his side as always, his expression serene. The human operatives, indistinguishable in their simple uniforms, had already begun quietly taking over key administrative posts, replacing layers of bloated bureaucracy with quiet efficiency. Orders were issued with polite smiles and precise instructions. The very atmosphere of the place seemed different now, as though the human presence had drained it of its old arrogance, and replaced it with a quiet discipline that was somehow more intimidating than any military occupation could have been. Delegates who had once mocked Kane now avoided even meeting his gaze in passing, shuffling quickly through corridors as though proximity alone might draw his scrutiny. They had seen the reports in his suitcase, had read the damning evidence compiled in brutal detail, and knew that there would be no arguments, no appeals, no chance to delay the reckoning. Earth's audit was complete, and its judgment final. The real irony, and one that Kane appreciated deeply, was that most of the records he had used to expose their corruption had come from their own archives, their own careless conversations, their own arrogance. All he had done was listen carefully, and collect what they freely offered. In the days that followed, the remaining council members met in hastily arranged private sessions, now stripped of the pomp and spectacle that had once defined their gatherings. Their debates were short, fraught with fear and resentment, but they all arrived at the same inevitable conclusion: resistance was not an option. They could no longer trust one another, much less rally together against the human presence in their midst. Cain had planted seeds of doubt and suspicion so effectively that even long-standing alliances had crumbled. Each delegate now wondered whether their colleagues might be working secretly with Cain's operatives or cooperating in exchange for personal protection. Meanwhile, Cain continued his polite but relentless presence. He offered suggestions, made quiet observations, and gently corrected inefficiencies wherever he found them. When the chief speaker tried to salvage some dignity by proposing a symbolic committee to review Earth's recommendations, Cain smiled and responded with calm amusement, suggesting that the committee might instead begin by reviewing its own behavior first. The chief speaker fell silent, his shoulders slumping in quiet defeat. Even the staff began to adopt a deferential respect for Cain, not out of loyalty but out of the simple understanding that he represented the new order. The human observer was no longer an observer at all. He was the architect of the council's reconstruction, and everyone knew it. Cain's work was meticulous and patient. He did not rush to dismantle the council's institutions outright but rather encouraged them to do it themselves. He asked quiet questions at just the right moments, posed innocent-sounding queries that exposed flaws and forced admissions of incompetence. Slowly but surely, departments were dissolved, redundant positions eliminated, corrupt officials quietly removed from their posts. No violence was required. Cain used the very weight of the council's own bureaucracy to collapse it from within. At one point, a desperate delegate cornered Cain in a private hallway and demanded to know why Earth was doing this. What did humanity gain from tearing down the most powerful governing body in the galaxy? Cain's response was delivered with the same soft, courteous tone he always used, but this time there was a steel beneath the words that left no room for doubt. Earth does not seek to dominate, he explained calmly. We seek stability. Order. For too long, the Council has treated Earth as irrelevant, while failing to maintain even its own standards. Your corruption endangered every species under your rule. We have simply corrected that oversight. The delegate opened his mouth to argue but found no words, no defense. Cain inclined his head politely and walked on, leaving the delegate standing alone in the dimly lit corridor, staring after him in helpless silence. As the days passed, the council complex itself began to transform. Gone were the ostentatious displays of wealth and power. The grand banners, gilded emblems, and ceremonial trappings disappeared quietly, replaced by efficient signage and simple, functional spaces. Meetings that had once dragged on for hours now lasted minutes, their agendas brief and practical. And always Cain was there, unobtrusive but ever present, ensuring that order was maintained. The final meeting of the Galactic Council was held exactly 1 week after Cain's announcement of Earth's judgment. The chamber was sparsely populated, with many seats empty, their former occupants having fled in disgrace or fear. The chief speaker, reduced now to a figurehead with no real power, stood before the assembly and announced the formal dissolution of the council. There were no speeches, no grand declarations, no final flourish. Only a simple statement, recorded and archived without ceremony, marking the end of an institution that had ruled for generations. Cain did not attend the final meeting in person. Instead, he observed from a quiet observation deck overlooking the chambers, sipping tea and watching with a calm satisfaction as the delegates carried out the last acts of their own authority. When the announcement was complete, he stood slowly, gathered his suitcase, and turned away from the window. The human operatives who had accompanied him stood ready, quietly taking over the final administrative tasks without fanfare. They knew their work was only beginning. Earth did not intend to replace the Council with a human empire. That would have been too crude, too obvious. Instead, they would guide the new governments that emerged from the Council's ashes, ensuring that the mistakes of the past were not repeated. Kane himself would not remain. His mission was complete. The real work would now be carried out by others, quieter and more patient still. As he walked down the final corridor, heading toward the shuttle bay where a waiting transport would carry him back to Earth, Kane allowed himself one final smile. The Galactic Council had thought themselves masters of the stars, untouchable in their power and arrogance. But in the end, they had been undone not by war or invasion, but by a quiet observer with a battered suitcase and a patient smile. And as the shuttle doors closed behind him, Kane knew that his work had set a precedent that would echo through history for generations to come.